Welcome to Bear in Mind, the Brown Psychiatry Podcast, clear current content about mental health. I'm the host, Dr. Tracey Guthrie, Psychiatry Residency Program Director and Co-Editor-in-Chief.
I'm the co-host, Dr. Camila Cosmo, Brown Assistant Professor and Co-Editor-in-Chief.
And I'm Dr. Marisa Hollinshead, Psychiatry Resident and Script Editor for today's episode.
And I'm Dr. Audrey Tyrka, the guest for today's episode.
Okay. First, a content warning.
In this episode, we will talk about sensitive topics, some of which you may find triggering. Our only purpose is to provide education and information. Our content is not to be considered medical advice. Today, we will discuss a sensitive topic, early life stress and trauma. These experiences can have long-lasting negative impacts on those who have endured them. As we will hear from today's guest, Dr. Audrey Tyrka, not all stress is bad for the body. What we are talking about today is the cumulative stress that over time can change the brain function, genetics, and overall health.
Research shows that the more stress and negative experiences we encounter, the higher the risk of developing substance use disorders, heart disease, cancer, liver and lung diseases, mental health disorders, and even suicide.
Today, we'll learn more about trauma and early stress from one of the experts in the field, Dr. Audrey Tyrka. Dr. Tyrka is the Mary E. Zucker Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Brown. She also co-directs the Center on Stress, Trauma, and Resilience at the Miriam Hospital. Internationally recognized for her groundbreaking work on early adversity, she has made important discoveries that have helped us understand the mechanisms of stress-related mental and physical health conditions. Welcome, Dr. Tyrka, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Welcome, Dr. Tyrka. So to start, can you please tell us what is early life stress and trauma?
Sure. So early life stress is sometimes called early life adversity, or you may have heard about childhood adverse experiences or adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. This refers to stressful and adverse or negative experiences that people have during childhood beyond the usual minor stressors and veering more toward trauma or major stress experiences that people have.
Mm-hmm. What are some examples?
Some examples would be types of abuse like physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. Children can be neglected physically or emotionally. There can be other types of experiences like childhood parental loss, death of a parent, or perhaps desertion by a parent, and other very upsetting and traumatic things that can happen within the family or within the environment, the neighborhood, or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And how do early life stress and trauma affect our mental health in childhood and adulthood?
Yeah, so, stepping back, thinking about it, children depend on their caregivers and other adults for basically everything, all of their needs, right? They need to be nourished, they need to be protected, given housing, they need to be protected both physically and emotionally. They need to learn how to handle intense emotions. They need to learn how to manage their behavior and engage in positive relationships with others. And, unfortunately, many of us aren't able to help our children or the children we care for learn all of those things. We may be stressed and have experienced early trauma ourselves, or we may be struggling with psychiatric conditions or other kinds of challenges, poverty, other kinds of experiences. So it's very challenging to be a good parent, as many people know. And so what can happen is if you don't have those kinds of protections, if you don't have that kind of nourishing, you can then end up having deficits or problems in your sense of self, your thoughts and feelings about yourself, your behaviors and the way that you handle your emotions, your feelings of sadness, anxiety, anger, and of course that impacts your relationships with other people. It also can affect how your thinking works, your memory, your ability to focus and concentrate and to sit still. And of course, these are very important for achieving success in school and being able to get through the school day. So really, it can affect all aspects of a developing child's thinking, feeling, and behaving, and over time can result in depression and anxiety disorders, and as was introduced at the top of the show, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use disorders, and others.
And Dr. Tyrka, you've touched on this in your previous question, but can you talk a little bit more about what happens in our bodies, like inside of our bodies, when we experience this cumulative stress?
Yes, absolutely. So, our bodies are very well adapted to handling stress to some extent. Experiencing stress is a normal part of daily life. Of course, we have many challenges, and there are many things in the environment that can feel stressful or be very actually traumatic and dangerous. So the body is very good actually at marshaling or developing or giving you the resources you need, the energy you need when you're facing a stressor. So for example, if you're challenged by, say, a dog, a barking dog that's chasing you down the street, you need to run from that. You need to figure out a way to hide or a way to protect yourself. So your heart starts pumping. You end up getting nourishment to and energy really to your brain, which needs to be able to think through, how can I cope with this? Is there a place I can hide or run to that the dog can't get to? Your muscles need energy to be able to run and hide. So that can work very, very well in the short term. But when that goes on for a long period of time or happens very frequently, those systems start to wear down. And you can then develop risk for a variety of diseases in the various organ systems that we have.
So if you're in adulthood, you're someone who's experienced early life stress, and you know this about yourself, either early life stress or early life trauma, are there things that you could do to reduce the risk of having that past history affect your current mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. There are many factors that go into making us who we are, right? And we all have stressors and challenges. And in fact, challenges can be good, right? They can sort of unlock parts of ourselves that we didn't know that we had and allow us to grow in certain ways if it's safe and if you can make it through that. There are many factors that contribute to resilience. So resilience is a quality. If you think about it in physics, resilience is thought of as, for example, the degree to which a piece of, say, metal can bend under major pressure without breaking, right? Same thing with humans. Same thing with our responses to things. So, how much stress can we tolerate without breaking? Obviously, we don't want to push it to that level, but there are many factors that we can use ourselves and that our environment and our communities can give to us that help shore up our strengths and help us learn to think about and cope with a stressor. So I like to think of it in a variety of domains. When we can think about our thought process and how we handle stress. We can think about how we handle our emotions. We can think about our behavioral responses and our behavioral habits. And we can think about our social engagement, our social relationships. So in terms of thinking, there are many ways we can cope with stressors. First of all, we can try to avoid them, at least the bad ones, right? So some things are stressful and they're good, but many things are not. We can think through, okay, how did that happen and how might I avoid such a thing in the future? Not everything is avoidable, and it may not be, is certainly often is not a person's fault if they've experienced that. Yet we know that some things we can avoid, and sometimes we need the help of a trusted colleague or coach or therapist to help us think through these kinds of things, but there are ways to do that. There are also ways to consider, what are my strengths, what are my challenges, and to build on your strengths, to grow those strengths and to feel good about yourself, develop your self-esteem, to understand what your weaknesses or challenges are, and either avoid things that bring those out or require those, and also to work on those things and to learn from others how you can best build on those or ask others for help in those areas where you're not an expert. So those are some things we can think about on the thinking side of it. I also like to think about having a growth mindset, which helps people to understand that life involves some failures. Failure is okay. And if we're not failing, we're not growing. And so when you reframe or when you think about things in that way, you recognize, okay, failure is okay. What can I learn from that? And how can I move forward in a positive way? So those are all examples of mental or cognitive things that can help somebody who has experienced challenging circumstances move forward in a positive way. Emotions. Emotion regulation is a key part of this, and it's very challenging for many of us, especially if you've experienced early stress, for a variety of reasons. You haven't learned, perhaps, from your caregivers who maybe were the source of your stress, how to regulate your emotions yourself. Your caregiver may have not been able to do that themselves. It's very important to first let yourself have that emotion. Experience it. What am I feeling? How does it feel? Both in my heart and in my body. What is my body noticing? And to really allow that to happen, allow it to be, allow yourself to feel it, and allow it to pass. Okay? You can't always just let things go, but if we sweep them under the rug or we bottle them up, oftentimes they will explode, right? Mm-hmm. So I think emotion regulation is something that's very challenging, and often it does require helping others in your life to understand what kinds of things are triggering or particularly upsetting for you and why, and how can we learn to help each other through these kinds of things. So that's with emotion. In terms of behavior, there are many things that we can do. We can identify, well, what makes me feel triggered or stressed? How can I avoid that? What can I do to take care of myself, both on a daily basis in terms of getting enough sleep, getting the right nutrients, making sure I'm somebody, they say I'm like a parking meter. You have to feed me every 2 hours. Yeah, so that's one of the things. You don't want to be too hungry, too tired. That can make it very difficult to regulate your emotions. And certainly it's important to be careful about using alcohol or other substances or not using those as either a crutch or a way to kind of numb emotions, because that can lead to further problems. But figuring out, what are the positive things I can do? I can listen to music. I can take a walk. I can read a book. I can take a nap. I can, have a massage or ask for some help. So those are some of the kinds of things that people do. And you'll notice that in many of the things I've been mentioning, I'm mentioning other people. And that's one of the most important things. Now, I'll mention that, we're all different. Some of us are more introverted and we need a lot of downtime, away from other people. But for most of us, we do get sustenance and nourishment from other people. And we can't ever do this alone, whether or not we've experienced major trauma, but especially if you've experienced trauma. And, of course, that can be very difficult, as I said, if you haven't had the experience where you have learned how to develop safe and trusting relationships with other people. So that may require working closely with a therapist to figure out how you can, what are the signs that you can trust someone and how you can begin to build that trust within yourself and with someone else. But that can be a very important pathway toward keeping yourself in a good state of mind and in a good place in terms of your emotions.
Great. So we understand that stress is part of life, but how do we know the difference between health and unhealth amounts of stress?
Yes, it's a great question. Well, typically healthy stress, it tends to be a shorter term kind of thing. It tends to be something that you're choosing. Not always. You or maybe your caregiver might be choosing it. It tends to be something that, might make you nervous or uncomfortable. You're stretching yourself, but you can tolerate it. And if you have control over it, you're choosing it. You can choose not to do it, or you can choose to back off. You might find yourself, oh gosh, maybe I went too far. I feel like I'm panicking. But you can back up a bit, or you can go through it and find, actually, I made it through okay. And as I said, with a growth mindset, what did I learn? How did I do? And let's move forward to the next time. That's in contrast with what some people call toxic stress, which oftentimes is uncontrollable. And with children, of course, as I mentioned, they are dependent. We, when we're young, are dependent on others for so much. So oftentimes, children are not in control of things. When it's very frequent, when it's very extreme, the stress is very extreme, when you feel like you don't have control over it, when you don't have others to help you, you don't know a way out of your situation, that can be very toxic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So feeling trapped is definitely one sense where you're having toxic stress. So we can go back to, thinking through someone who's tuned into this podcast to about the title of early childhood stress, early life trauma. And they identify that this is something that resonates with me. I am going through this, or I have gone through this, and I don't know how to deal with this. In the work that you've done, what are so someone's in that place. They don't know what to do. They don't know, they know that something has happened to them. They haven't told anybody that something's happened to them. What, in your experience, in your work, clinically and in your research, what are the first steps that you think that they should take? Where should they go from that point of recognition that something, acknowledging that something happened, that I may be someone who has experienced this? What's the first step that they should take?
Yeah, great question. And that, that's true for many people who, oftentimes people don't recognize this for quite a long time. I'd say the first step is really to identify a trusted person who you can begin to share that with. And that doesn't mean opening up all at once necessarily and sharing the entire experience, but it means baby steps towards starting to trust and starting to open up, and all the way asking yourself, how does this feel? Mm-hmm. Do I still trust this? Am I doing okay? Is this working for me? So that could be a spouse or a family member. It could be your doctor. It could be a friend or a spiritual leader or a coach or a teacher or somebody. It's oftentimes helpful to share that with a doctor who may be able to, or another care provider who may be able to suggest a route to therapy or counseling, because oftentimes, especially if it's been a traumatic experience or it has major long-lasting effects, professional help and psychotherapy is very, very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking about this in the context, too, of getting kind of back to that resilience topic when we were speaking about that, and just kind of thinking about the role that our community can play. And I think you were touching on that. Do you mind just expanding on that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, with the resilience, there are so many different ways. I think I mentioned several of them that we can become stronger and get through these kinds of experiences. And many of them involve other people, right? So some of that is around, one-to-one with psychotherapy or counseling or working with your doctor. Some of that is around friendships and other kinds of relationships. Some of it, again, may be with a spiritual guide or other person that you trust with some wisdom and caring for who you are and your development as a person. Oftentimes, one of the biggest factors for resilience involves identifying a real sense of purpose. What do you care about, and how can you contribute your particular strengths to further that cause? And that often is done in community. So there's good evidence to show that people who are contributing together with others to a cause greater than themselves, that they really have better mental health and more resilience. And there are many, community groups out there, volunteer opportunities. People often feel like, oh gosh, I'm so depressed, I'm so anxious, I don't have enough to give to myself. How can I possibly give to others? But paradoxically, that's not how it works. Many times, if you are able to get yourself there, very oftentimes giving leads to more for yourself as well as for others.
So in thinking about a person who's now acknowledging, at least just to themselves, that they may have been someone who experienced an early life stress, whether it be neglect, abuse at any age, bullying, anything that caused them significant distress and feeling trapped in their circumstance and not having the support that they needed during that time. What are some of the ways this might manifest for them? What is it that you've seen? How does this, they may not think at age 9, oh, I'm experiencing early life stress and I don't have the things that I need. That's not what happens. So what is it that people tend to experience so that if you're experiencing and listening to this, you can identify it for yourself? What does that look like?
Yeah. So there are many, many ways this can show up. It can show up with anxiety, with feelings of depression and irritability, moodiness. It can show up with sort of behavioral explosions. Some of it, of course, depends on the age. With young children, it can look like behavior out of context. People be scratching their heads, not understanding why the child is melting down, why the child is having, upsetting behaviors, might be becoming violent or very afraid, avoiding things, not wanting to go to school or come out of their room, etc., not wanting to go to sleep. There can be physical, and that can be true of older children and even adults as well. There can also be physical symptoms, feeling nauseated, feeling sick, pain, fatigue, other kinds of symptoms that go along with it. And oftentimes it really can show up in relationships. So snapping, for apparently no reason, but there is a reason. It's just that it's not apparent. Neither person in the relationship or the people in the family don't necessarily know what is causing that. But perhaps something in the environment or something in the interaction reminds the person either in their head or in their body of what happened before, and a reaction comes out because they're scared.
Right. No, that's very, very helpful for people to be able to see that in themselves.
Yeah.
And getting back to resilience, Dr. Tyrka, is resilience always good? What do we need to understand about resilience in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, going back to how I began talking about resilience in physics, right, where you have a great amount of pressure being applied to, say, a piece of metal until it breaks. We don't expect or want people to be withstanding that much pressure until they finally break. And sometimes I fear that we use that term and we expect people to be strong, to not show weaknesses, to not be vulnerable, to not acknowledge to themselves or to others that they're hurting. So no, we don't expect everyone to be resilient. And there, as I mentioned before, many different ways we can be resilient and many different ways we can not be resilient, or we can be vulnerable, or we can be hurting. And so it's a matter of understanding all the different parts of ourselves and honoring all of those different pieces. And as I said before, strengthening our strengths and, getting help with the areas where we are struggling. So I wouldn't, I do think that especially when people have been through very painful and terrible things, you are resilient just by surviving. And there are many things that you do that show your strength and show that you're trying hard. The other thing I'll say is that oftentimes people who experience stress and trauma are focused on fixing things. And that's how they survived in their childhood, right? They're able to kind of figure it out, find a way through, make it work, and not get dragged down in the emotions. But that only goes so far. And it doesn't allow the emotional richness that you can get to in life once you allow yourself to relax a little bit and start to explore the vulnerability and start to trust in yourself and another person. It takes time to do that, but I think well worth it when we can.
That's a very important point, a very, very important point. So I want to go back to another point that you made, which was if you are a parent who has experienced early life stress yourself, it's very difficult with all of the challenges of parenting and life and working and providing to be everything for this being that needs everything from you. So for someone listening, is in that circumstance, that they have had this experience themselves and they don't want this to pass on to the next generation. that that's a concern that they have. What advice do you have? What does the research show about that dynamic?
Yes, yes. So I would say, the cliche about put your own oxygen mask on first. You have to take care before you put one on someone else. You have to take care of yourself first before you can help another. So first of all, you want to make sure that you are, again, listening to your own emotions, your own body, taking care of yourself, getting the support you need. And unfortunately, many of us aren't able to get the support we need. So I want to acknowledge that. However, support does come in a variety of forms, right? Mm-hmm. It might be your neighbor. It might be a support group online. It might be your doctor or a teacher. You might do some journaling and find your own support within yourself. There are many ways to do that. Once you take care of yourself, then you can give to another. And I would say it's important to recognize that it's not going to be perfect. Parenting is never perfect, and caring for another person in a relationship is always has problems in it. You will do the wrong thing many times. It just has to be good enough. You just have to show that you care and create space and love for this other person. And then, of course, finally, none of us can do this by ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
We have to do it in community.
And talk more about it. What can caregivers do to support the well-being and reduce stress for infants and young children?
Yes, yes. So, it depends on the developmental stage, of course, what children and infants need. Structure is something that is very helpful and important, and many of us are not particularly good at that or oriented toward that, and perhaps especially if you yourself have experienced early stress or trauma. So, but with infants and young children, structure is very helpful. Right. So if you know that there's a time for sleeping, there's a time for resting, there's a time for eating and for working and doing your chores, you may resist it. It may be hard. Your child may resist it, but over time they get to understand those patterns. If you yourself have trouble with that, there are many ways you can work on developing that structure. There are apps. There are people who can help with that, a counselor who can help with that, or a family member. You can write things down. That helps a lot. Not expecting too much, again, from yourself or from your child. Making space for the emotions, for the feelings, and for the bodily sensations, as I said earlier. Oftentimes, again, if your orientation is toward fixing things, you might be quick with the tissue box to try to shut the emotions down. But that's not what we need. When we're hurting, we need to feel and express those emotions and work through them. So that would be my recommendation. And then, of course, getting the help and support of a counselor or another trusted person.
Mm-hmm. What do research studies tell us about stress and trauma so far?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of exciting research happening, and there has been for many decades. The more recent work focuses on a variety of aspects of this. First of all, I would say we are still learning what kinds of things really are stressful and traumatic, and to which people. All of us are different, right? And what is going to be stressful? I mentioned introverts and extroverts before. What's going to be stressful to an introvert might be very different from what's going to be stressful to an extrovert. Or if you've experienced trauma before, your level of stress and your type of stress is going to be different than someone who hasn't. We are now doing a lot of work on the effects of racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination, and this very impactful effect of that and the stressful impact of that over time on people. So that's an important area of research that, frankly, has been ignored for far too long. There's a lot of work understanding the biological stress response and really the connection between being exposed to stress and trauma and how it's related to these health problems that we mentioned earlier, like cardiovascular disease and weight gain and obesity and pain and even cancer. And so we're trying to understand how that works, both so that we can understand who might be especially vulnerable to that, who might be more protected, and are there treatments that we can develop that will help with those biological consequences. And then there's also a lot of work being done to understand how do we better help people? How do we better treat people who have experienced stress and trauma, both in terms of medications, neuromodulation therapies, and especially psychotherapies. And there's a variety of forms of psychotherapies that have been used to treat stress and trauma.
And Dr. Tyrka, do you have any resource that you'd like to recommend to our audience to learn more about early life stress and trauma? Any local, national resource that we can share?
Yes. So locally, we have our COBRE Center on Stress, Trauma, and Resilience. COBRE stands for Centers of Biomedical Research Excellence. And that's the website for that is starcobre.org. But nationally, I would recommend the National Center for PTSD. That is through the VA, but it doesn't just focus on combat trauma, but other related stress and trauma as well.
Dr. Tyrka, one of the things that, that you were talking about was kind of this emerging research and focus on racial discrimination. And, I think about that really within the context of where we live, the neighborhood we're raised in, where we work, where we play. What is some of the research that's coming out about that, and what do we know so far?
Yeah, so, there's been a lot of increased interest and work on the social determinants of health. And we know that those kinds of determinants, which are things like living in poverty, neighborhood violence, pollution in the air, as well as the racial and ethnic discrimination that can lead to that very poverty. All of these things come together to affect our stress response system, our inflammatory system, and can lead toward a variety of stress-related health conditions. So they often go together, and unfortunately, some of us are burdened with many of these things all at once because of that kind of discrimination.
I can also imagine that what people call stress varies culturally and varies generationally. So something that may be very stressful to Dr. Hollinshead may not be stressful for me, or vice versa, just based upon our identities, where we were raised, how we were raised, our age, are there other identities? Is that something you've seen also in your work?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there's some good evidence that the subjective experience, how I identify my stress versus how you might identify something that happened to me, is what's most important for me, and in terms of my own coping, my functioning, and the development of psychiatric disorders. And yes, different cultures approach things differently, but it's important to note that within a culture, you have individuals, right? And so again, it's how the individual experiences it as influenced by their cultural environment, as well as their other aspects of their milieu.
And a final question before we let you go, because I'm sure we could talk about this for a very long time, but what do you see on the horizon in research? In being in this field, doing this work for as long as you have, what is your hope and your aspiration of what your work will lead to?
Yes. Well, really, my greatest hope is that we will prevent much of this stress and trauma. Some things are not preventable, of course, but so much of the kinds of things we're talking about, abuse, neglect, and really we talked about, oftentimes parents are not equipped because of their own struggles to provide what their child needs. And often those struggles are related to structural things in their environment as well. And so there's much that we can do on the policy level to change how people are experiencing things and to give people the support they need.
Let's hope that occurs. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Tyrka.
Thank you, Dr. Tyrka.
Now a take-home message to bear in mind.
So today we've discussed how a small amount of stress can actually build resilience, but also the harmful effects of sustained stress in early life trauma on mental and physical health can be damaging. Communities and families can protect young people by providing them with safe and supportive environments, building strong relationships and community is crucial. Having a caring adult in a child's life can make all the difference. Also remember that self-care is essential, as Dr. Tyrka pointed out, before you can care for others. If you or your family have experienced anything we discussed today, please talk to your healthcare provider because help is available.
And as always, if you or a loved one is having suicidal thoughts, please contact the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, call or text 988 or access 988lifeline.org. The Lifeline is a 24-hour toll-free phone line. You can also go to the nearest emergency room and ask for help.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. For more information related content, please check out our Instagram, X, Facebook, and YouTube channels. Bear in mind the Brown Psychiatry Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.